Well, thanks to the few people who are in this room and the rest of the people who are online. If you are just around the corner on campus, feel free to come down because there are way more cookies and fruits than participants here. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we meet on Wajak Nyungar Buja, Nija Buja, Wajak Nyungar Buja. This is Wajak Nyungar country. This is a country that was never ceded, and in the years that it took to basically take this country away from Aboriginal indigenous populations, of the many things that were taken away are also the many languages that were spoken here before colonization. There is an estimate that there were about 350 languages spoken across Australia, with some quite interesting and complex patterns of multilingualism because of the nature of the kinship system and because of the nature of the seasonal migration of the different nations, so that there was a high level of multilingualism, often trilingualism involved. A lot of the knowledge has been lost, many languages have died out, and today there are very few languages that in terms of endangerment we would describe as vital, as having vitality, meaning being fully functional and fully spoken. And it is actually no surprise that the field of language endangerment has a lot to owe to Australian linguists, among others, who really lay the ground for a lot of materials and methodologies that we use today. So my aim today is to do a few things. I want to share with you the background to my discipline and why there are people out there who are actually interested in diverse languages, and even more so in languages that are under the threat of extinction. And I'd like to share how we get there, why we got there, and what that tells us about the contribution that linguists and the knowledge of endangered languages can do to social justice. Just this morning, there was a really interesting piece of news, which I am now trying to show you, if I figure out how to deal with this. And that is not the piece of news, this is the piece of news. There is a new app out there from the, yeah. Excuse me, that's
right. You've opened, oh gosh, where are we? I think you can just minimize that.
Yeah.
And share.
Yeah.
Chrome.
Yeah.
Double click, oh, share, sorry. And find the one you want.
This is the one I want.
Yeah, it's going now.
Okay. Is this the best of technology that we have to actually show slides and share links? This is the process that you all go through when you...
I don't try and share too much.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. I feel for you even more. So just this morning, there was this really interesting piece of news, and I immediately went to download the app, the Kaitetje language, which is spoken north of Alice Spring. The community developed a new app that captures 100+ emojis, and through emojis shows sounds and meanings of this language. And it's just a light and fun but precious way to encourage community members to download the app. I have it on my phone, of course, now, and I'm playing with it and then learning words. And so you can click on a football and you will hear not just one, but 3 or 4 different people pronounce the word. It's quite sophisticated because it's youngsters and elders, so that you hear the slight differences in their pronunciation. And it's just something to encourage people to engage with the kind of everyday knowledge, everyday usage of words that we have. And it's free to download. I encourage you to go and play with it. This is one of the hundreds, thousands of things that have been popping up over the last 10, 15 years as technology has moved from the more scientific field of language to community-based usages, and where people just embrace readily available technology and start building repositories of knowledge that they are afraid might be lost, or that they know has been lost in a number of cases. And as I said in my acknowledgement, the history of colonial Australia is also a history of language extinction, language death, and there is a deep connection between the work of early linguists in this country and my own work and the work that we do in endangerment. Okay, now I'm going to try my hand at this again, and eventually I'm going to get the hang of it, and I'll go back to my presentation. So the field of linguistics is actually of rather long-standing origins, because in many ways linguists tend to agree that probably the earliest historical linguist that we know of was Panini, 500 years before current era. And Panini wrote basically a grammar, a study of form and meaning of Sanskrit that is still used today to actually look at Sanskrit grammar, understand how Sanskrit work. So he was way ahead of the time in terms of, do we have to have this here? In terms of his understanding of language as a system. And throughout different traditions, throughout the Western world, Eastern tradition, indigenous traditions, of course, philosophers of different traditions return to the issue of language in different ways throughout the times. But when it comes to the modern discipline of linguistics, it is probably in the 19th century that we see some real development in the sense that scholars start becoming aware of different languages out there. For the longest time, in the Western tradition at least, knowledge of Greek and Latin dominated everything we knew about language, and those were pretty much the categories that we used when we looked at language as an object of study. And then we start becoming aware of other languages, especially Sanskrit. We start becoming aware of the fact that actually languages seem to share certain common characteristics, and there might be historical reasons or there might be other reasons why this is the case. And so people start formulating a number of assumptions or theories about language. And some of the ideas that shape our current engagement with languages out there are summarized here. The first one is the idea of a link between culture and language. The fact that a specific language has a particularly intimate connection to its culture that is very different from the connection that a different language has to that culture. And that in a sense, language and culture can mirror each other in any given group. And this relates a lot to the idea of Volksgeist, the spirit of the people, that especially scholars such as von Humboldt were interested in. In a North American tradition, anthropologists such as Sapir and Worf develop an interest in linguistic relativism based on this, and that is the idea that there are different forms of linguistic relativism. In a very strong sense, linguistic relativism tells you that your language actually constrains your thoughts, that what you can think of is determined by the linguistic categories of your language. In a milder version, which is a more widely accepted version, relativism tells you that there is a link between how you speak and how you think, because obviously the only way to express your thoughts is through language, and therefore there is something to be said about that. We move back to the Western tradition, and we find a figure that is often considered father of modern linguistics, Saussure, who, funnily enough, Saussure in his lifetime never published anything about linguistics. He published all kinds of stuff on poetics and on, well, he published stuff on the etymology of Sanskrit and on other non-European languages. But in terms of linguistics, what he did is that he taught a course throughout the last few years of his life in Switzerland, the course of general linguistics. And after he died, his closest students put together these lectures into the course, as it's known, and that became Saussure's contribution to modern linguistics. And fundamentally, well, he had quite a bit to say, and he had some very interesting ideas about language, but Saussure is the first one that makes a clear distinction between language as a system of signs that are connected and that work in a particular way, and language as a social phenomenon, language out there as something that is constructed by speakers who engage in communication. And this distinction is going to remain fundamental for the whole field of modern linguistics. And the field of modern linguistics would not exist if it weren't for Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky is really what projected linguistics into a modern study, because his ideas are should I accept or decline? And that is because his ideas were extremely controversial. They were very strongly argued. They were fiercely debated, fiercely defended. And so whether you became a Chomskyan or not, you had to engage with what Chomsky said. And in fact, for the last 20 years of the 20th century, Chomsky is the most cited scholar of the planet, and he is already in a league with Marx and Freud in terms of the quantity of references that his work attracts. But mind you that Chomsky is not only a linguist, he's also a strong political activist. He has written widely about Vietnam and other conflict. He is a very anti-establishment thinker, and it is his political work that mostly gives him these stratospheric numbers of publication, but as a linguist, he's very widely cited and very widely respected. And Chomsky basically reacts really strongly against behavioralism of the time and defines linguistics as a cognitive science. He says language is innate because of a number of reasons. Language is innate because, language is innate because, taking a very Platonic view of categories, children are born with linguistic knowledge. At a certain critical age, they start to speak, he claims, and they don't have that knowledge taught to them. Nobody teaches them. They develop language spontaneously. They develop it in a very rapid way, because a child develops language in a way that an adult learner could never acquire. They become fully competent in that. Again, something that is much more difficult for an adult. Throughout the mess that is language spoken out there, they emerge with the perfect grammatical knowledge of that language. And to him, these are all arguments for why there must be innate linguistic categories in the mind. So this develops the notion of universal grammar, the first big revolutionary idea that he throws out there. The notion of a universal language is not new. The notion of universal language you can find in pre-Enlightenment philosophers, where they were thinking of a language of God and things like that. But the way in which Chomsky uses it is completely different. It's about pre-existing linguistic categories in the brain that we are all born with. And he claims language evolved as sudden mutations in humans. That is, it's not a gradual development. We did not grow language from our ancestral ape forefathers through various stages. It just happened in one subset of the population, which is something that evolutionary biologists will tell you can happen in species. So there is, in principle, nothing against it, not that we have any evidence of this. And finally, the third property that makes human language completely unique and different from any other animal communication system is that it is recursive, that it builds on a finite number of elements that can be embedded into each other endlessly. And this kind of diagram here is a classic example of that, and you don't need to know what the PPs and the DPs are because that is all generative grammar and not so interesting to us. So at the point at which I entered university and studied linguistics, studying linguistics meant studying Chomsky. There was hardly anything else available. So you went for linguistics, you were going to learn Chomsky's universal grammar theory, you were going to learn transformational grammar theory, and you were going to work in this system. And for me, that was particularly interesting because at the time at which I was studying linguistics with some of Chomsky's first disciples, I was also learning Chinese. I was learning Mandarin Chinese at university. And as I learned more of one and more of the other, I started struggling to reconcile what I was learning of Mandarin Chinese grammar with what Chomsky was telling me were universal grammatical categories. So I was kind of lucky in a sense, because of this completely coincidental combination, I figured that there were things that weren't working for me there that I couldn't understand. So when I finished my first degree, I decided to go and do my PhD in what was at the time one of the biggest non-Chomskyan schools, and that was the Stockholm School of Linguistic Typology. So typology is a consequence as well as a reaction of Chomsky's powerful program. Whether you are a Chomskyan or not, if you want to find out what are the universal properties of language, it makes sense that you expand your database from just looking at English and German and French, which is very much what they were looking at in the beginning, to as many diverse languages as possible, because that's going to inform your understanding of language structure out there. And even more so, if you start suspecting that there is something in this universal grammar that isn't quite working for me, by looking at languages that are completely divorced from Indo-European languages, you find a diversity of structures, a diversity of categories that you have never imagined previously. So this really galvanized the whole field to go out there and start studying languages as far and wide as possible. And it's amazing how much has happened in 50, 60 years. So nowadays, you have amazing databases of linguistic knowledge that tell you a lot about linguistic diversity. And in linguistic typology, typically you do things like these. You can ask the question of, is there a dominant word order in the world languages? From Chomsky's point of view, it would be, is there a universal order? And at one point, his theory claimed that subject, verb, object, surprise, surprise was the universal order to which all languages return. It turns out that is not at all the case. It turns out, according to typologists, that the most widespread and common word order is a verb final order, as you find in languages like in Japanese and Korean. And you will see on this table that it's actually found in 239 different families of the word languages, while SVO is found only in 55, and that is partly because of colonialism, because English and Portuguese and Spanish were imposed on large parts of the world where they were speaking completely different languages. So that when you look at a map, linguists love maps. I will show you a number of maps. For example, you see that the whole of South America, almost the whole of South America is red, not because those are the original languages of the place, but because Spanish and Portuguese are widely spoken there now. There are some areas that are characterized as others that include our very own, that is not out of ignorance of this map, but because where linguists have no full agreement on how to classify, they leave it as other. So for example, when it comes to the languages of Australia and Papua New Guinea that are often referred to as Pama-Nyungan languages, scholars are still not in agreement whether that is an appropriate classification. And where there is still a lot of debate is in the nature of a relationship between Papuan and Australian languages. And so for the moment, rather than put there a name that people are not confident with, they leave it blank. And that happens in a number of parts of the world where there are uncertainties. But you can see clearly the effect of colonialism when you compare the colors of Western Europe and the rest of the world. That doesn't apply to Central Asia. That is the Indic branch of the Indo-Aryan languages. So those are related and those belong to the same large family. I'm sorry that this thing keeps coming up. I can close it, right?
You can minimize it.
I can minimize.
Oh, you can, yeah, you can make it.
Not this one.
I don't know.
I can't do that. Okay, all right, never mind. I won't do. By the way, sorry, I should have said this at the beginning. You want to stop me on any of this, stop me. I never prepare to speak too long. I always prepare to speak little so that there is time to discuss it. Or we just go back to it later on. So as I said, what is impressive is the amount of stuff that we have accumulated over the last few decades. And that has a lot to do also with the kind of technological aid that was being developed at the same time. Linguistic typology, linguistics in general, owes a lot to computational developments, to our understanding of databases, our facility in establishing archives, especially in Europe, in the years in which I was active there. Funding for linguistic databases was very generous. A lot of projects were available and there was a lot of work going on. And so there was a lot of stuff generated. Now I will stop and I will share. And I've just picked a few for you to have an idea of what is out there, but I'm happy if you are interested in specific things later on to tell you more about it. Now I just need to find it. These are all endangered languages. Okay, so for example, the World Atlas of Language Structures is available online. It's a huge repository of a very large number of languages from all over the world. And you can search it in a number of ways. You can search it by type of language, or you can search it by type of features, which is something that linguists would do. A typologist, for example, a typologist is interested in, let's say, something like, we were just looking at word order, right? So let's go to word order again. And for example, you might be interested in knowing how common the order of subject, object, and verb is. This first one here. So you can just click on it. It gives you a map. You can play around with this map. It gives you the different types of orders. It gives you the distribution. You can then play with the map and adjust it to your own needs, whether you want to only look at SOV, whether you want to look at something else regionally, and so on and so forth. It gives you references for all the languages there so that you can actually find out where the data comes from. It gives you links to further articles, papers, chapters available about the languages. It's an incredible trove of linguistic data, or you can go by language, or you could go by country, and just pick anything that you want to know about. And you can see that it includes sign languages, and it will give you very detailed maps with the location of the different groups from which the data was collected. So I'm showing you this because I want to make the point that in doing this kind of thing, a lot of work went into this archive to try and make sure that A, we can verify where the data comes from. B, we can attribute the data properly to the people who provided them. We can allow everyone who wants to follow up on these links and read more about it in terms of making it available open source. So it's something that was created trying as much as possible to share the knowledge of the things that had been accumulated as widely as possible. Oh, no, so I should have stayed in there, right? Clearly, I'm not very good at this yet. Yeah, it's this one, right? Okay, so there are other types of databases out there. For example, you have Glottolog. Glottolog is now no longer active, but it's still open as an open source kind of things. It gives you a lot of information about different languages. People still add new languages at times when there is new research being done. So for example, here we have Khoi from Papua New Guinea. You just click on it. It gives you a map of exactly where it is spoken. It gives you a lineage, meaning tells you which other families it belongs to. It gives you references and more refined data farther down. And one more that I had just prepared here for you is Ethnologue. Ethnologue is particularly interesting because it also has various featured articles. For example, you see here just on the landing page, how many children lack access to education in their first language, or more oftenly asked question, how many languages are there in the world, and so on and so forth. So these are just 3 big websites, repository of languages that give you a lot of information about the 7,000 plus languages that we have. And if you want to, I can share the slides with you so that you actually can get access to these sites. The other thing that led to the rapid development of these wide sets of data was that there was a lot of work being put into making sure that these databases could talk to each other. So there was a lot of sharing of data across some major projects, and that is how we ended up knowing quite a lot about linguistic diversity. So through this vast amount of knowledge, we can construct all kinds of maps and all kinds of visualization systems to give us some indication, for example, about linguistic diversity around the world. Now, linguists work with a particular kind of index that helps us determine whether 2 systems of human communication are actually the same or different, and that's quite a complex thing, but basically a lot of it has to do with mutual intelligibility, and where you have 2 dialects, 2 varieties that are quite different from each other in terms of how they are spoken. From a linguistic point of view, you will consider them languages, and you will assign a certain element of diversity. And this map is interesting because it shows you the level of homogeneousness or heterogeneousness of areas in terms of languages. So the lightest colors mean almost everyone speaks the same language, and the deepest color means almost everyone speaks a different one. And then it also gives you the percent of indigenous languages in percent of the particular place. So for example, you can immediately see the biggest hotspots of diversity: Papua New Guinea, Borneo, Central Africa, India, where we know that there are some of the most amazing diversity of languages and language families. And for example, it shows us that Papua New Guinea is the linguistically most diverse country that we know of. And you can basically play around with these databases and generate any kind of visualization that you're interested in terms of seeing how languages are distributed and how they are represented. And just to give a fun example of how much linguists love maps, you can even look at London Tube system and learn which non-English languages are spoken around which station. And that probably would also be a really interesting guide to good food around these places, because you can obviously see where the Gujarats cluster and where the Japanese cluster and where the French cluster. And so there are really interesting applications of all these data that you can do depending on what you are interested in finding out. So that's how we come to endangered languages. Obviously, as linguists and anthropologists out there learned more and more about linguistic diversity, they also realized that, sadly, not all languages are created equal, or maybe they are created equal, but they certainly don't live in equality, and that there are huge discrepancies between the status, the vitality of languages around the world. When is a language endangered? If you go into the literature, you will have, as usual, scholars disagreeing with each other, but basically a language is endangered when it's not being used between parents and children. The moment parents stop using it or start using it less and start constraining the use of a given language in the home, that's when a language starts losing vitality, and that is the beginning of endangerment. Why does it become endangered? How does that happen? Well, there are all kinds of reasons. Languages can be exterminated because people are exterminated, which is almost what happened in Tasmania within the first 30 years of colonization, though it's actually untrue that all languages disappeared. There are still some remnants of Tasmanian languages there, but with very, very few speakers. But languages can become endangered also in less violent ways. They become endangered because they lose status, or because they are contrasted with a language that has much more status that people want to acquire. And rather than maintaining their own and acquiring the new one, they simply get rid of their own and move to the new one. This can be historical, accidental, or this can be engineered through language policy, for example. So a majority of the history of Western Europe is a history of language loss, because when Europe transitioned from a sort of feudal medieval system to nation states, one of the things that went out of the picture was linguistic diversity. You can't have a nation without one language, so the idea goes, and therefore you need one standard language that will become the language of power, the language of justice, the language of commerce, to the detriment of the other languages. For example, in my own country, in Italy, which on that map that I showed before, by the way, is the most diverse country in Western Europe, there were regional varieties that are mutually unintelligible to each other. So I'm not talking about dialectal variation, I'm talking about different languages, different grammatical systems that in my father's generation were still spoken, but were not transmitted to me because I was learning standard Italian. So in my household, I had a grandmother who spoke Neapolitan, because half of my family is from the south, half from the north. She spoke Neapolitan with me. I learned to understand it, but I didn't have anybody to speak it back to. This was my luck, because I can walk into any fantastic Neapolitan movie and understand everything, while my fellow my friends in my hometown, Genova, they don't understand Napolitan, so they can't actually really appreciate those movies. My dad spoke Genoese from my hometown, which is related to Provençal, to the French side, but he didn't transmit it to me, so I didn't learn it, and as is typical of all major European cities, my generation does not have any knowledge of these regional varieties that were spoken just a generation before. Can you reverse the process? Yes, you can. That's when we talk about revitalization. We can revitalize languages. How do you do it? I'll get to that later, but basically there is a vast amount of linguistic knowledge and language technologies available, and where a community is interested in generating a revitalization program, we know that there can be very positive, constructive collaborations between community and linguists to develop material, resources, practices that the community can take forward and revitalize the language. Facts about endangerment are more or less here, and a bit of a cutout down there, but I can fill in. We know that there are over 7,000 different languages being spoken. We know which one is the most spoken. Interesting fact is how few languages account for a majority of the world's population. That is, there are about 400 languages in this world out of the 7,000 that are the languages that matter, to be perfectly crude. The languages in which we write, the languages in which we publish, the languages that we can use in court, the languages that we'll get as a job, all those things. And the rest are not part of this. There is a big discrepancy in terms of diversity and distribution of power. The remaining languages are spoken by only a few small groups. There are even a number of languages where we know there is one last speaker remaining. So quite staggering statistics if diversity is something that you are concerned about, and usually you can have very heated debates about these things. There are on one end of the line, you will have the view that, well, look, this is just, you know, historical development. Languages are fundamentally just communication systems. Some remain, some go out of the window. You know, it's not a big deal. This is the kind of argument that you could apply to any kind of loss of diversity. At the other end of the spectrum, that is the argument that says, well, actually, if you think of languages as the ways in which we think about the world, then what this means is that we are using, at best, 400 different ways of looking at the world, and the other 6,600 ways that these other languages represent are not being factored into wherever we are going with our approach to the world and to knowledge and society. Just as was the case for linguistic typology and linguistic diversity in general, there are very specific and very interesting resources for endangered languages, especially. So I will just show you two. The Endangered Languages Documentation Program is probably the foremost training program for documentary linguists in the world, though there are others that are very good. But this is the one dedicated one. It's been housed at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, SOAS. It was set up with a tiny little percent of the interests of 1 year of the Rousing Foundation, which is a foundation that was developed based on the inventor of the Tetra Pak. So a little tiny portion of that went to support a program that set up at the time at which it was set up, definitely the most ambitious and beautiful program for documentary linguists. and the one that is still uniquely dedicated at that, which trains hundreds and hundreds of linguists with the mission of going out into the field and documenting, archiving community languages, and doing so in ways in which communities were ethically represented, respectfully represented, where communities had the say in what to make available and who would have access to it, in ways that were as sustainable as possible in terms of leaving behind structures and practices and support for the work to continue owned by communities, not by linguists. So there is a lot of beautiful work there to be looked at, and if you are interested, I really encourage you to take a look. And another one that I want to show you is this, the Endangered Languages Project. The Endangered Languages Project is an interactive database. You can go to it and you can have detailed views. And for example, we can look at Australia here. We can go a little bit north of Perth and discover something about Nanta, how it's classified, how endangered it is, alternative names, number of speakers, 2 references to it. So just like we saw for the whole big world of diversity out there, we have dedicated databases for endangered languages especially.
What was the one on the south coast, if I may?
Let's go and find out. Let's go and find out.
This information is put together by people in communities.
So that's a very good question, and I'll get to it. So alternative names. Obviously, you know, with caution, because we know that these things change and that we don't always get it right. So to your really interesting question, there has been a major shift in the way in which linguists do documentation in the olden days, in the days of anthropological linguists. Linguists went into communities, whether they were invited or not, took their notes, did their stuff, left, and never appeared again. That was the history of the early days of anthropological linguistics. This modern take on linguistics really became extremely focused on making sure that whatever happened was documentary knowledge in the service of communities where desired, and otherwise stay the hell out of it. So it really made a strong effort to move away from that kind of colonial knowledge stealing approach to recognize that it can only be done in ways that are appropriate and in ways that are welcome, and that ultimately it has to end, and I'm going to get to that, with the community owning whatever was developed and deciding wherever they take it to. So that was a big shift. It involved extremely interesting conversations with all kinds of people. One of the most interesting conversations that is still ongoing, because nobody can make a commitment to where it should be taken, is the question of intellectual property rights. How do you define the intellectual property rights in a language, and who owns it? Because the language is a community thing. It's not owned by one single individual who can determine. It's owned by a group, and they have very different views of that. So they don't agree on one way of putting this. So lawyers won't touch it. They stay away like mad. We used to involve lawyers in our workshops and seminars and really push them, you know, how do we get to the nuts and bolts of this? But they are very careful because it's really a difficult environment. I'm happy to talk more about that. So language death, then the sad end of the process if nothing is being done about, but sometimes inevitable. It is interesting to note that in many, but not all cultures, language is associated with cultural, historical, and spiritual identity. I have worked in communities where that is not the case, where there is an intrinsic pragmatic view of language and where there is really no such association. But more often than not, you have that link. And in these cultures, the loss of the ability to speak is linked to a number of things that we know are social challenges, trauma, marginalization, issues with the law. These are very, very well established connections. And these are not only found in endangered languages and languages that are dying, but even in languages that are just minority, marginalized, low status, stigmatized. So these correlations are very evident. In the field of linguistics, number of reactions to this, and obviously what I'm showing you here, this whole modern development of documentary linguistics is one reaction. But at the more conceptual level, the best known one is the linguistic human rights paradigm, which is well established in the sense that, for example, UNESCO subscribes to linguistic human rights. And when you go to UNESCO and look up language, you will learn a lot about what linguistic human rights mean, which essentially means that there is an individual as well as a collective right to language choice for both private and public representation. If you take this to the extreme, this would mean that anyone can choose the language in which it is represented in the court, or goes through a job interview or what have you, and you know that this is not the case, right? Also the right to language choice in accessing knowledge, but actually we know that that is not the case because we have at best 400 languages to access knowledge out of the 7,000 plus, okay? And basically linguistic human rights means seeing language choice as a human right. Slightly different way, which is not in opposition to this, it's just going in a different direction, is the notion of linguistic citizenship. Linguistic citizenship recognizes in a sense that while this is aspirationally fantastic, it is practically probably unachievable. But what it does make a point is that we would already go a long way if we were able to recognize that for democratic participation, we should allow a much higher variety of practices to exist. For example, code mixing between languages, using a partial knowledge of language A and partial knowledge of language B in a formal context, which is something that we can't do, right? Not even in the most established bilingual countries, such as Canada, would we allow people to express themselves in French and English in the same sentence in a formal context, right? In that sense, it calls for a wider empowerment of practices of language that are being seen as transgressive or grassroots, but that in fact are highly normal in spoken language communities, and especially in languages where multilingualism is high. So I just wanted to highlight these two, the most dominant one, a really intriguing one, and I'm happy to give you references to it if you're interested in it. So the modern documentary linguistics field is really the one other reaction to this, and it calls for basically a return to linguistic anthropology, but not in the colonial sense, in the new technologically and ethically empowered sense that involves linguistic field work, which means working with communities, that involves language documentation as a very broad process. So language documentation is not just about transcribing the grammar as the early anthropological linguists did. So the picture that you see there is a classic setup of documentary linguistics. Sounds, images, you usually have a person at the back looking at the context and looking at participant elsewhere. It is very important to capture hands, expressions, to do so in a number of different ways, sometimes involving only one participant, sometimes whole groups. It relies on deep analysis of the data in terms of understanding how the languages work, because that is essential to the production of revitalization resources if the community wants to develop those revitalization resources. It requires a deep commitment to archiving and access that is equitable, that is just, but that is also culturally respectful. It could lead to developing policies, either at a local or at government level. And most important, whatever is done remains within the hands and the control of the communities that have participated, and that has to be recognized at all times. I just want to finish. I said I wouldn't talk long, and I'm talking a lot instead, which it's so therapeutic to be able to go back to linguistics when you are in my role, I tell you. I just wanted to give a brief taste of one of my own involvements in this field. So I guess my longest involvement in this was in Sri Lanka. So there is another website that you can go to if this thing goes away from me, and let me see what I have here. So the Dobes is a smaller archive. It's housed by a foundation known as Volkswagen. It has nothing to do with the car. It's a scientific foundation based in Germany. And it's focusing on the documentation of endangered languages, and this was the funding agency for one of my projects. So if you go to the little island of Sri Lanka and click there, you should, no, you don't? Okay, so you do get to the Sri Lanka Malay, which is a mixed language of Malay and South Asian origin that is actually spoken by a relatively good number of people by endangerment standards, but was certainly endangered in at least 4 out of the 5 communities that we work together with in Sri Lanka. So when you go to this website, you can access a little bit of information about people and practices. In one picture, you will even see a very young version of me with my head bent on something, probably a microphone. This was a documentation of an endangered Creole, which actually happened to be the first one of its nature. And there was an initial community connection where there was an expression of interest in not quite revitalizing, but engaging with linguists in terms of how to view the future of the language, let's put it like that. And that was because at the time, there was quite a big debate in the community whether there was value in maintaining this Creole language, or whether the community should shift to a modern standard version of Malay. And so this was how we became involved in it, and how we participated in many community projects, as well as quite a lot of work on documentation in terms of understanding how the language worked and archiving it for posterity for those parts of the communities that were interested in that exercise. Was very fascinating. I can tell you more about it if you're interested. There were a number of dimensions of challenge to be navigated. Creole languages are by themselves stigmatized. So when you have a language that is both a Creole and endangered, and definitely not standard and non-majority. You have a whole host of stigma against that language that you need to work with. The particular context of Sri Lanka then was that there was a very clear linguistic dimension to violence that characterized the island for 25 years. Sri Lanka Malay was not part of it, but in the ethnic civil war between Sinhalese and Tamil, one of the things that could happen to you is that you were pulled out of a car and they would ask you to speak. And if you happened to use the wrong variety, depending on who was pointing the gun, you were dead. So identification through language was a very sensitive issue there, which was another interesting dimension to navigate. There were quite some differences between the rich central Sri Lanka Malay communities and the poor peripheral Sri Lanka Malay communities in terms of where they wanted to go. This refers back to what I was saying before, that even within a language community, you get a whole diversity of ideas and wishes and destinations. And so it's, you get to juggle it. And there is the broader question of the future of Muslims in Sri Lanka, especially at this very moment, that is particularly dangerous for them. But I'm now running out of time, so I might return to this if you're interested. For me, there are a number of things that are fundamental in terms of doing documentation in a socially appropriate way. These are 4 of them. And I think that the second and third point are really particularly interesting for us as scholars when we work with resources that come from the outside and have all kinds of strings attached. And then when we are actually involved in the very work, we realize that some of those strings are constraining us from doing the right thing by the community. And there are interesting ethical questions that arise there. And what the fundamental outcome of any documentary project in endangered languages should be, which is really something that should be beneficial and owned by communities. So, last slide. There are elements of doing linguistics, documentary linguistics, and working with endangered languages that clearly connect to social justice in a certain way. But there are also quite some limitations that at least I have experienced. These limitations could be limitations that can't be overcome, or they could be seen as part of the evolution of the field and society and where we are going. But in terms of language as a symbolic power, in terms of that aspect of language that relates to ourselves, our past, our culture, our thoughts, the things that mean to us, engaging with endangered communities, doing documentary work is very meaningful. The documentation creates an archive for posterity that can be entirely owned and accessed by community alone, if that's what they wish. That perhaps a few generations down the road, people think, I would actually really like to know how grandma spoke, and perhaps I would like to teach myself that. And when you have the kind of rich archive that I have described with sounds, images, visuals, metadata, you can do that. If you move into revitalization, you could even have an immediate effect right there and then. For example, in New Zealand, when Maori started being taught in the language nests, and when the first generations of children started coming home speaking Maori, you suddenly had a lot of parents who had to go to evening classes to actually learn Maori because they couldn't understand them. So it happens within a generation, and it can happen then. The Maori case is quite rare and quite unique, but it has been done. When it comes to language as economic resource, it's much more limiting, because obviously, if languages don't have political power, they remain limited in the efficiency that they have for a community. There, what you can work with is a shared understanding of practices of the fact that speaking different languages at the same time is not an issue, can be done, does not detract from the proficiency. And we know this from the many examples that we have of successful multilingual countries that work on different dimensions. Often in communities you find a view that it's either A or B, but it can't be both. And that is not at all the case. And there are many long-standing traditional practices of multilingualism that have existed for a long period of time. And there, for example, in our case, there was a lot of engagement with communities where we invited community scholars of different opinions to exchanges and debates, and where we offered the kind of knowledge, evidence, and support that we have as alternative ways of seeing things, and where something could be done in that direction. But the economic pressures on a community are often in themselves a factor of endangerment. And the same goes for language as a political capital. Language is instrumentalized, language is manipulated. For example, in the context of Sri Lanka, as I said, language can also be a matter of life and death, but it's certainly a matter of success or failure. Documentation can definitely be used for conservation, for preservation, for posterity, as I've already mentioned, but it can be used for policy making. So one of the things that I think we have realized now in the past couple of decades, scholars of all persuasions, is one of the things that we need to do much more is policy, and speak to governments and speak to authorities, and put the kind of knowledge that we have in very simple ways to try and influence the kind of decisions that they make on matters, for example, such as language use. And finally, endangerment can be used more widely in language education. For example, UNESCO has lots of campaigns to share the knowledge of diversity, of language loss that is out there. They have programs, they have campaigns, and there are many ways in which these things can affect. For example, they can simply generate funding to initiate new projects, but they could also change ways in which policies are made at national levels. And I will stop with this to just give you a simple example. A good former colleague of mine from Sydney, who is a linguist and who has worked on the Sydney language, has recently claimed that one fairly simple way in which we could raise awareness of diversity and of indigenous languages in Australia is if each primary school offered a program in the local language for all children. This is something that would be a very simple thing to do. It is something that would be very conducive to many of the things that are debated in this country about reconciliation and truth-telling. And ideas such as these ones, for example, in different contexts, for example, in Canada, have gone quite a long way in establishing at least a presence and the recognition and the respect for indigenous languages, indigenous cultures out there. I'm done.